Welcome back to the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. I'm Thomas Woods, and we're talking today about Catholic moral principles that most people, non-Catholics included, have come to take for granted. In fact, so much so, they hardly even look for their source. But their source, as in the case of so many wonderful fruits of our Western civilization, is in fact the Catholic Church. And so we've looked at infanticide and gladiatorial contests, and suicide, and now we're beginning to look at the subject of war. The just war tradition develops in the Catholic world, perhaps beginning with Ambrose, but definitely beginning with St. Augustine. St. Augustine had a great deal to say about the justice of war. What's interesting to note, as I said before the break, is that there really wasn't anything like a just war tradition prior to Catholic reflection on the subject. And this is very much different from the views that we see in the 16th century with a famous political philosopher named Machiavelli. Machiavelli was in effect of the opinion that governments could not be held up to moral standards the way individuals were. Governments in effect had to do what they had to do. But the Church condemned that view and was condemning it as early as St. Augustine. So, for example, some of the principles that were laid out by Catholic thinkers, according to which war could be justly waged, were as follows. For example, St. Thomas Aquinas, in his famous segment on war, said that it's important that the war be declared by the pertinent authority. An individual on his own cannot simply go and declare war. It has to be somebody who holds legitimate, duly constituted authority. Secondly, there has to be a just cause involved. Any old reason for waging war is not acceptable. And there has to be a right intention. You can't go to war solely out of desire for vengeance or just for a desire for conquest. So in other words, war cannot always be justified. Just because a war is going on does not make it just. So St. Thomas set down these important principles. And then with the passage of time, we begin to get the development of the just war tradition in the Catholic Church even further. In the 16th century, for example, a great man at the University of Salamanca named Francisco de Vitoria had much to say on the subject of the just war. And a couple of Catholic historians have recently summed up his view, I think very nicely and eloquently. Vitoria, in effect, said as follows, that assuming that a prince has authority to make war, he should first of all not go seeking occasions and causes of war, but should, if possible, live in peace with all men, as St. Paul enjoins on us. When war for a just cause has broken out, it must not be waged so as to ruin the people to whom it is directed, but only so as to obtain one's rights and the defense of one's country, and in order that from that war peace and security may in time result. When victory has been won, victory should be utilized with moderation and Christian humility. Francisco Suarez likewise said, a just war must be waged by a legitimate power. Second, its cause must be just and right. Third, just methods should be used, that is, equity in the beginning of the war and the prosecution of it, and in victory. The reason of the general conclusion is that although war in itself is not an evil, yet on account of the many ills which it brings in its train, it is to be numbered among those undertakings which are often wrongly done, and thus it needs many circumstances to make it honest. Now, that is at least a brief taste of the just war tradition, and there are, of course, modern just war theologians who are trying to adapt this tradition to modern circumstances and continue to develop it. But the critical idea here is that states are subject to moral rules and cannot simply do whatever they wish. They are not allowed, for example, simply, for no other reason, simply to go out and slaughter civilians. There are rules on how war should be conducted, and that is because of the Church's emphasis on the sanctity and dignity of life. Now, I recall years ago, back before my Catholic days, I was a student at Harvard, and that is a whole other show in itself, what it was like keeping your sanity being at Harvard. But I remember one of my dear friends at Harvard. His name was Fred DeCaro, lives in Connecticut. He's actually designed my website for me for free, so I figured he gives me a free website, I mention him on television. Well, Fred DeCaro once said to me when I was still a Protestant, he said, he asked me why I wasn't a Catholic, and I gave some hemming and hawing answer. I didn't have any good answer. I don't know. I haven't thought about it. I haven't spent the time to think about it. But I asked him why he was one. Why are you a Catholic? And there are a lot of different reasons people could give for this, right? I mean, well, I was swept up by the Bible. I was swept up by the story of some saint. A lot of people prayed me into the church, or some argument convinced me, or whatever. But his answer was very simple, and I never forgot it. And it stayed with me all the way to my conversion. He said, because the Catholic Church tells us how to lead the good life. That's simple. The Catholic Church tells us how to lead the good life. Couldn't ever get that out of my head. Because I thought to myself that what the Church teaches in so many areas is in fact challenging to us. And in some ways, it's a real challenge to the baser part of our nature to live up to the great ideal that the Church holds out to us. But I remember coming to the conclusion one day that everybody at some point in his life has to answer the question, do I intend to live as a human being, or do I intend to live as a beast? And the Catholic Church holds out a glorious and noble path of life in which you're not self-absorbed, in which the whole world doesn't revolve around you, but you are part of a nexus where you care about other people, and you care enough about yourself to treat yourself with dignity. And I recall there's a quotation from Seneca, an ancient Roman, who said, "What a contemptible thing is man if he fails to rise above the human condition." Even a pagan Roman understood that there's something about unaided human nature that is incomplete, that cannot live the virtuous life without extra help. So it was almost as if Seneca understood that if we're going to live a life that truly befits a human being, we need the assistance of divine grace. Now, the animal kingdom is composed of creatures who possess only instinct. They can't engage in moral reflection. They don't possess reason. So it stands to reason that we human beings should be held to a higher standard than the beasts, that we should observe moral principles, we should reflect on our behavior. Now, all this went through my mind as I was considering converting to the Catholic Church, and I was attracted to her moral teaching. A lot of people say, oh, the Church is too tough in her moral teaching. She'll drive people away. To the contrary. People ultimately, deep down, want to be challenged. They want to be challenged by holiness. And I remember that that's what attracted me. And I remember learning that in ancient Greece, Socrates had said that to know the good is to do the good. That as soon as you know what the good thing to do is, well, you just automatically feel compelled to do it. But I knew that wasn't so. I knew of many times in my life when I had perfectly well known what the good thing was to do, and I absolutely had not done it. And I had perfectly well known what the evil thing to do was, and I had pursued that. So much for Socrates. But then you read St. Paul. And St. Paul has so much moral realism when he says that there are times when I know perfectly well what the good is, and I shun it. And I know perfectly well what the evil is, but yet I pursue that. And I remember once I finally did convert to the Church, I remember my spiritual director telling me that the next time I was tempted to eat a cupcake, I should have a carrot instead. Now, what did he mean by that? Did he mean that cupcakes were evil? He meant that cupcakes are delicious. That's why it's an exercise of will to avoid them. And that by avoiding something like a cupcake, which is morally neutral, I can train my will. I can, in effect, tell myself, I am in control. I'm not going to be swept away by passions. I'm not going to be swept away by irrationality. I can train myself, because by avoiding cupcakes and eating carrots, I train my will to be able to say no so that when the moment of temptation comes and I really am faced with a choice between good and evil, I will have a will that is trained to face it and come out victorious. Now, what a beautiful message this is, that as a human being you have such a dignity that there is a special kind of life that God wants you to live that is appropriate for you as a human being. And I was recently at DePaul University. They had an event called Catholic Week. I won't get into Catholic Week at a Catholic university. What about the other 51 weeks? That's another matter. But when I was at DePaul, a reporter for the student paper asked me, how would you sum up your talk? Give me one sentence. Well, I couldn't give her one sentence. Gave her two or three. But I said, here's what I would say to the students at DePaul. I would say that the Catholic Church is the most beautiful institution on earth. And if you want to live a good life, if you want to live a life that befits a human being, the Catholic Church has much to say to you. And that's a message I think a lot of young people who are totally adrift could stand to hear. Of course, I feel old anytime I start talking about young people, but such is life. Now, let me conclude with this. The Catholic Church consistently emphasizes the dignity and value of human life and tells us that we are to live in constant awareness of our created nature in the image and likeness of God, that we are not to live as beasts, that we're not just to do whatever brings us pleasure, then we might as well be a cow. You're not a cow, you're a human being. Christ didn't die for cows, He died for you. And He died in part so you could live a good life, so that we may be worthy to join with God in heaven. What an astonishing statement. It's particularly beautiful that the Eastern Fathers talked about deification, that in effect, as we live the life of the sacraments, we become like God. Now there is some real dignity. There is the idea that human beings aren't just random assemblages of cells, but they are worth something. They matter. And here's something you can finally tell to teenagers, that you don't have to live this crummy life that MTV is holding out for you. What in the world is there to compare between MTV and the Catholic Church? 2,000 years of heroism and holiness. And they think so little of young people they're going to hold out the MTV alternative? Forget it. Ditch it. Don't live as beasts. Live as human beings. That's what the Church has to tell us all. Now, there's another way that the Church has emphasized the dignity and rights of the individual, and that is with the very idea of rights. And that's what we're going to pick up next time. Where does this idea that I have a right to life and a right not to be robbed or expropriated, that comes also from the Catholic Church. So join me next time for the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. See you then.